I am high above the Atlantic. The Canadian prairies lie behind. Buckingham Palace lies ahead. Ovid Mercredi, former chief of the Assembly of First Nations, has invited me to join a delegation of Indigenous elders, veterans, and chiefs. We are going to England to meet with the British Crown, to mark the 250th anniversary of the Royal Proclamation, and to talk about a broken covenant. For many Indigenous peoples, the Royal Proclamation of 1763 is crucial. Influenced by over a century of treaty-making and negotiation, the proclamation recognized Indigenous rights to self-determination. It recognized a form of title and jurisdiction to land across much of Turtle Island, or what is more commonly called North America. I arrive in London with unease and unanswered questions. Why is this old colonial legislation still important to First Nations? How will the British Crown and the royal family respond to these leaders? And in what way is the proclamation relevant to non-natives like me living in Canada? As I walk the streets of London for the first time, I can feel the history around me. The royal imprint is in the streets and on skyscrapers. Monuments and memorials narrating the exploits of Britain's past are everywhere. For centuries, Indigenous leaders from nations across North America have journeyed to this powerful city. As Britain expanded its presence across Turtle Island, the need for treaties became increasingly important. Treaties to figure out how natives and newcomers could coexist. Simply put, the Crown wanted to ensure peaceful settlement and access to land and resources. Indigenous peoples wanted to ensure that the land was shared fairly and in the context of ongoing relationship. This trip is a first for most of us. Our energies are focused on October 7th. That's the day on which King George III issued the Royal Proclamation 250 years ago. It's also the day we hope to meet with the Crown. But it's not the 7th yet. With time to spare, I connect with some of the elders and chiefs and ask why, long after the end of the British Empire and the emergence of a modern nation-state like Canada, they think it necessary to meet with the royal family. Many Canadians would dismiss this as a political charade. Many would encourage these Native leaders to move on from the past.
Yeah, I was on the legal team for the last Canadian case ever decided in London, or England, I guess, for that.
Yeah. What was it on?
On the Canadian Constitution. We didn't want it patriated. We didn't want it patriated unless treaty rights were entrenched in the Constitution.
Right.
So we had to go to court actually to get that. So I spent a lot of time in this area here. Important for me to be here, not only to commemorate with the other chiefs the significance of the proclamation, but also to perhaps get new energy in terms of going forward and continuing the work, so that Canada at large will know more about the Royal Proclamation. Yes, they may know it was in 1763, but what they may not know is through the Constitution of Canada, it still applies today.
The world needs to know that Canada is a great place to live, but unfortunately for the Indigenous peoples, there's still great poverty. There's still oppression. There's still economic marginalization. There's still caps on education. There's still disparity in funding levels that don't even keep up with inflation. Those things are still persisting in Canada. And we've got to really collectively work together through our minds and hearts and find the proper mechanisms and way to move forward. We've come through 500 years of colonization and oppression. Our Indigenous peoples have survived the residential schools, which was basically cultural genocide, where we weren't allowed to speak our languages, where our ceremonies were no good. They're just, anything good about being a First Nations person was beaten out of you. We've survived that as Indigenous peoples. We've survived the colonization and oppression through the Indian Act, that federal piece of legislation that was enacted in 1876. But we have a long way to go. So we still say we're still here. So there will be a bright hope for our future, and as the medal says, as long as the sun shines, the rivers flow, and the grass grows, that this treaty, this covenant with the Creator will remain in effect, so that our children and grandchildren and those yet unborn will benefit from these terms and conditions. That's our hope, that's our prayer.
I was beginning to understand why the Royal Proclamation and the many treaties that followed in its wake mean so much to these leaders and their communities back home. In their eyes, they are not simply historical contracts, one-time deals struck in the past. They are living agreements, sacred covenants, if you will, on how we can live together. But what exactly does this proclamation say? To gain some clarity, I travel outside London to the National Archives. Here I can see the proclamation with my own eyes and witness the reaction of the delegation members.
See, there's another line though I'm looking for where they refer to the nations or tribes of Indians. There's another line. Over here.
Yeah.
Can you read this one, Kay? It's clearer here.
Okay, it's right there.
And where it is just and reasonable and essential to our interest in the security of our colonies that several nations are tribes of Indians with whom we are connected and who live under our protection should not be molested or disturbed in the possession of such parts of our dominions and territories as, not having been ceded to or purchased by us, are reserved to them or any of them as their hunting grounds. Hold up the Royal Proclamation of 1763 as our Magna Carta, in a way, because it opened up all these countries for settlement, because it paved the way for treaties. This paved the way for the treaty-making process, and it recognized our sovereignty and nationhood, and that's a big thing. So that's why we say we're not ethnic minorities. We might be 4% of the population in Canada, but we might be low in numbers, but that doesn't make us ethnic minorities. We're Indigenous peoples with our own land, laws, and languages, and our own identifiable people inherent right, and it's recognized here. This forms part of Canada's Constitution. It's referenced as part of Canada's Constitution.
It really is stunning to be in the presence of history, but to see once again affirmed in such a tangible way the understanding way back then that you're dealing with sovereign nations, and that idea, which would seem enlightened now, that it existed back then, it's, the seeds of a better future found in the past.
Ovid Mercredi invited me on this trip because I work with the church. Ovid said this was a chance for the Christian community to relearn the promises of the proclamation and to figure out its part of the covenant relationship. I didn't come by myself. A small group from different denominations and grassroots organizations came to London. On the eve of the 7th, I meet up with a few of them, the Indigenous Anglican Bishop Mark MacDonald and representatives from Christian Peacemaker Teams, an organization that supports Indigenous struggles for land justice.
Being in the UK all my life, and only really when I started to do my CBT training and finding out about the work that this team had done in the past, and like, oh, there are Indigenous people in Canada. This is new information, and there's a history there, and realizing I knew nothing about the history of colonization, and hey, even the history before that, just had no conception of that. So when I think about Indigenous communities that are still facing challenges to their land base, I think, well, that's the same system, the same kind of power at work. And therefore, if we just read about residential schools and think that was very sad, we shouldn't do that exact thing again. We shouldn't set up a system of schools that take people out of their communities and try and assimilate them. So it's like, well, why were they being assimilated? What was the reason behind that? So that for me is the key piece that I think it brings it into the here and now, and into the, well, how's this happening, and how are people being assimilated, or how is the land base being threatened?
But those ideas about acculturation, assimilation are like embedded in the white paper, right?
Right.
And sure, it's not happening all at once.
Yeah.
But those policies are still being implemented gradually over time.
Like what?
There's still the need and desire to take us off our land, right? To make our land fee simple.
Yeah.
So it's part of the systems.
I am surprised by the conversation. I thought we'd be talking more about the past. The Royal Proclamation was addressing questions of land and jurisdiction over 2 centuries ago. But for my colleagues, this trip isn't about commemorating an important piece of history. It's about the present, addressing the land issues of our day.
This is a time to call the churches to live up to that reality that they created. Because to a certain extent, you could say that the churches animated colonialism, because they provided the mojo really to make it seem impressive and right and good, and when the church said, well, finish that, and then walked away. So I hear elders say all the time, a lot of bad things happened when you came. The worst thing that happened is that you left. That you're no longer there. You don't care about our kids dying. You don't care about our women being murdered. You don't care about any of this stuff. You came and you messed up everything, and then you left. I hear that all the time. But there's a lot of people who understandably feel glad they left. And I think that part of why this is important to me is that even though I represent an Indigenous church, right, it seems to me that we have to call the churches to their responsibility in the treaties. They have a unique and special responsibility, even those that weren't present at the signing. A unique and special responsibility because they created the framework that led to the treaties, and let First Nations people see the treaties as a ceremonial, theological, spiritual act.
I was encountering a lot of new and difficult information. It was going to take a while to process it. Yet slowly, despite questions and concerns, I could see that this proclamation was important, that it mattered to me. As someone living in Canada, as a member of the church, I am an heir to a profound and complicated tradition of treaty making. I am part of a treaty people. For most of my life, I had no idea. Sean Atleo is the former National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations. Like Bishop MacDonald, Atleo stresses that the way forward is through treaty. He believes that we can all live together in a way that will work for everyone if we embrace the spirit of those original covenants. Why make a trip all the way to Britain? Some back home would say it's the Canadian crown that's important. Why come here?
Well, the Crown, through the Royal Proclamation, made one of many important promises that included that the Crown, even before Canada was established, would be there to support, protect the Indigenous nations in what is now called Canada. And this is brought forward in contemporary terms in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It reminds Canadians and the Canadian government that it is a successor state, that as such it inherited, as did all Canadians, an obligation to support First Nations and in fact to recognize that all Canadians are treaty peoples with an obligation to support the implementation of those treaties in the spirit and intent with which the First Nations peoples understood them. In other words, that it's about equity, it's about mutual respect, it's about seeing one another both formally and informally. This is a moment of reckoning. And the Indigenous young people are saying we need to come together like never before. We're stronger when we come together. Those barriers were not created by us, including provincial, territorial, and international boundaries. And by extension, they're reaching out to, as we discuss here, the settler community, saying, you know, you didn't create the Indian Act or the residential schools either. You by yourself did not make it so that this would not be taught in schools, and so therefore the children don't understand the principles embedded in Treaty Number 3 that we should support learning about each other. But that doesn't mean we can't do something about it. And I believe that we're entering an era of reconciliation, and for me and the people I represent, this is the era of Indigenous peoples. It's been a long time coming that we would take our rightful place in our respective territories. And the Royal Proclamation and treaties say that we're not to do this alone, that we're all treaty people, that we're all here to stay in our respective territories, including in what's now called Canada.
October 7th arrives. It is the 250th anniversary of the Royal Proclamation, and we are eager to have an audience with the Crown. How do they understand this relationship? Are they prepared to stand behind the covenant they entered into? Will they call upon Canada, who inherited the promises of the proclamation, to do the same? But we soon realize the meeting is not going to happen. Neither the Queen, nor the Prince, nor any representative of the Crown will meet with our delegation, a delegation that has traveled over 5,000 kilometers to mark this moment, a delegation that includes veterans from the Second World War, veterans who fought voluntarily in defense of Great Britain. We would soon find out why. As Chief Bellegarde prepares for a news conference later that day, we see on a newsroom monitor what some of the royal family were busy with this morning: a football game on the Buckingham Palace lawns. What the television didn't show is that just a few hundred meters away from that football match, a pipe ceremony was being held. Elders and chiefs came together with church members and many others to remember the proclamation, to honor the sanctity of the treaty relationship, to offer prayers for their people back in Canada, most of whom are still living with the difficult legacy of unkept promises.
I was very, very impressed with the pipe ceremony. To be there with elders, especially the person who was from World War II. All of my family participated in all of the wars. My dad was in the First World War. And of course, coming here to see the statue of Queen Victoria, my dad used to tell me stories. When he was wounded, he was brought here to London, and Queen Victoria used to visit just about every day. So he honored her very, very much. I was disappointed that no member of the British royal family was there. It didn't matter who, as long as there was a representative there.
So the Queen hasn't met with us. How are you feeling?
Well, I'm not surprised the Queen's not meeting with us, because that requires the cooperation of the Canadian government. We don't have a very liberal-minded government in Ottawa, and they don't have the same understanding of history, because their understanding of history is the exclusion of our people from Canada, and the idea that we're in their way of their sovereignty. It's absolutely true. We are in the way of Canadian sovereignty, and that the treaties are conditional in terms of the rights they give to Canadians. It's based on whether they honor the treaties or not, and the Canadian government's very aware of that. At some point in time, whether it's my generation or the next generation or the generation after that, Canada will have to honor the treaties anyway. It has to happen. Otherwise, as we get more and more stronger as a people and more involved in terms of international affairs and politics, we will use international law against the Canadian government.
I mean, every time one of the royals comes to Canada, Aboriginal people spill out into the streets, right? They're honored, they're given names, they go out of their way to visit the communities, right? It may be a roadshow for them, but it's not a roadshow for First Nations people, right? And when they came here, I know that the Royals were prepared to see them, and that this was refused by the Canadian government. So it's more of that oppressive denial of the fact of a relationship. It's pretty sad.
Malloy's statement is jarring. Last year, when Prince Charles paid a visit to Canada, members of this delegation met with him and requested a meeting with the royal family. The prince responded positively. I thought that the meeting didn't take place today because the Crown decided that it just wasn't willing to take the time. Sources close to the royal family, however, state that they were. Yet in order for that to happen, they needed the okay from the Canadian government. Permission was sought, but Canada chose not to respond. Although there are no royal family members present to honor this sacred moment, no government representatives here to mark this historic and living relationship, we get word that there are some British citizens for whom this does matter. Just down the street from Buckingham, a small group of young women and men are planning an action in connection with the global Idle No More movement, a grassroots Indigenous-led movement that started on the Canadian prairies.
So we're here this morning because this is the Global Day of Action in solidarity with Idle No More, and we wanted to show our solidarity right here in London for Indigenous land rights.
Britain was built on stolen wealth from the colonies, and everything, we're in the heart of London today. Everything we see around us has, if you go far back enough, it has its basis on economic relationships that were deeply, deeply exploitative, and that still have effects both here and in Canada.
One of the reasons I've been trying to learn more and understand more about Indigenous sovereignty in Canada is because of the Canadian government pushing tar sands and pushing tar sands into Europe, and Europe being a big import of the Canadian tar sands, and the impact that the extraction of the tar sands is having on First Nations people and their lands and livelihoods and health.
The exciting thing is more and more people are waking up. They're waking up to the injustices and inequalities, and I think people just in general are frustrated because there's a lot of people benefiting from treaty and there's a lot of people who aren't.
As our journey draws to a close, delegates are invited to Canada House in Trafalgar Square to speak with the Canadian High Commissioner, Gordon Campbell, a senior diplomat who advances Canadian interests in England. It isn't the British Crown, but it is an opportunity to call for, even demand, the repair of this broken covenant.
I'm here not just to commemorate an historical event, but to remind ourselves of the work that is unfinished. We still have to fulfill what I call the promise of the Royal Proclamation of 1763. And the promise is really quite simple, and that is the idea of coexistence, people living together in a peaceful way, but also people living together where no one dominates, where each nation is allowed their way of life, their culture, their religion, their language, their territory, so that they can not only provide for the individuals, but they can rise to society. Because the promise of the Royal Proclamation is not about just settlement for the non-Indigenous people, the people that came into our lands. It was also about respecting the rights of the people who are already there. And that is the outstanding promise of the Royal Proclamation that we have to remind ourselves about.
I am disappointed that the British Crown didn't meet with this delegation. I am upset that Canada prevented it from happening. The powers refuse to see Indigenous peoples for who they are: treaty partners, sovereign communities deserving of respect, nations with rights to their respective territories. But ordinary Canadians can still choose to see such realities. We can learn from the many Indigenous movements that are creatively working to decolonize and renew relationships across Canada. We can support Indigenous communities that are seeking the restoration of their traditional lands. Movements like these are not new, yet their legitimacy is found not only in their deep roots or because their efforts resonate with ideals of fairness and equity. It's also because their efforts are supported through formal covenants like the Royal Proclamation. As I return to Winnipeg, Manitoba, Treaty 1 territory, the challenge for me is, will I and the community of which I'm part join in? Will we seek to become the treaty people we are? Will we pursue respectful relationships with Indigenous neighbors and nations who are right next door?